Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 56 of Now and Men, the podcast on men, masculinities, and gender equality. It's Stephen Burrell here, and I'm with Sandy Ruxton, as always. How are you doing, Sandy?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. And I should just note that we're recording this whilst we're sitting next to each other, which is a bit unusual, but Stephen is currently visiting the UK. So how are things with you?
Yes, I'm good as well, thanks, Sandy, yes. I'm pleased at the moment because a briefing paper which I wrote together with Professor Nicole Westmoreland, who we actually interviewed back on episode 14 of the podcast, who also helped us set up the podcast. We wrote this briefing paper together, and that's recently been released for the End Violence Against Women Coalition here in the UK and the Firebird Foundation. And it's basically calling on the government to take more action, to invest more in preventing violence against women and girls from happening in the first place, including by engaging with men and boys about being part of the solution. Yeah, so hopefully that will help to contribute to some much needed kind of policy change here in the UK.
Yes, and I see the UK government just announced, just after you released this paper, that they're going to put £53 million into rolling out perpetrator programmes over the next 4 years. So great impact, Stephen. Although I'm sure that's actually the result of sustained campaigning by many people and women's organisations over a long time. And of course, I should say that this is not a panacea. It needs to be part of a wider programme, including more sustainable funding for women's organisations. But today's episode also addresses violence against women and girls because our guest is Clare McGlynn, who is a professor of law at Durham University. Clare has expertise in the legal regulation of pornography, sexual violence, and online abuse, particularly image-based sexual abuse. So, in other words, taking, creating, and sharing intimate images without consent. And in 2020, she was appointed an honorary KC, which means King's Counsel, in recognition of her exceptional work within the legal profession. And she's recently been appointed to the UK's Independent Pornography Review Task Force.
Yeah, it's such a privilege to have you with us, Clare. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, no, thank you for inviting me.
So we thought we'd start off by asking you a bit about what you think about artificial intelligence, because of course this is something which has been discussed all over society, what implications it's going to have for all sorts of different walks of life, I suppose. But perhaps something which is going under the radar a bit in those discussions is about how AI, potentially risks exacerbating gender inequality and undermining women's rights and safety. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about that, about why there are those concerns?
Yes, I mean, we're definitely living through an exciting age, aren't we? We're at the very beginning of this AI revolution. It's going to be fascinating, maybe when we have, podcast 256 or something, or hundreds, to see what happened. You asked me about its impact on, say, discrimination and violence against women and girls. I could talk about that, but really what I will do is talk about Laura Bates's book, because she, feminist author, renowned feminist author, has just published a book talking about, she calls it the new age of sexism, basically about how AI is supercharging discrimination and sexism in a whole new range of ways. And it's deeply disturbing. We're already living that, but it's also going to get worse, which is what she kind of sets out in that book, and talks, very vividly about how, we're on a precipice. We could take action to try to reduce the harms, or what seems to be happening is we're going full speed ahead, full throttle, with very little regard to the kind of adverse impacts that it's going to have.
I mean, your research, some of your research shines a light on some of the kind of emerging forms of violence against women and girls being facilitated by AI and other forms of tech. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Any examples, perhaps, of some of the kind of ways in which this is being used to facilitate violence against women?
So probably the most common or most well-known form or way in which AI is being used to harm and abuse women and girls at the moment is through what's called deepfake technology, which is where, an ordinary image of someone is superimposed into a pornographic video, or where people use what are called the nudify apps, where you can upload an image of someone, and it's mostly women. The programs tend to only work on women's bodies, and seconds later it will download a nude of that woman. So that I think is one of the most common ways in which AI is being used at the moment to threaten and target women. I mean, it's impacting on our democracy. It's pushing women out of public life. But it, young girls in schools as well, are having to face this reality of the young boys in their class nudifying them and then sharing these images online. So, but I think some of the interesting things even about deepfake technology is we knew about this in 2017, but we're only really waking up to it in the last couple of years. And we're only now taking some legislative action about it. So, it's such a slow way or pace of change to react to these sorts of harms emerging.
And why is it, do you think, that sexism and misogyny are so prolific through some of these new technologies, some of these platforms? Does it have to do with the fact that the kind of tech industry, these tech companies, they're quite masculinist, I suppose, aren't they? If you look at who's running them, who's working in them, it's, very male dominated, and that maybe is driving some of the ways in which these organizations are functioning. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think you make a very good point. They, like many industries, but particularly the tech industry, it is very male-dominated and very masculinist. I guess if we take a longer trajectory, over the last 40, 50 years, and probably even longer, actually, I mean, the male desire to abuse women and girls, I'm afraid, does drive technology. And the predominantly male desire for more pornography also drives, innovation in technology. We know that in the porn industry, that desire for more led to the DVDs. The JPEG technology that we're all familiar with, that was pioneered with a nude centerfold. That, the computer scientists sitting in the lab needed an image to test out their, new creations. One of them just happened to have a nude centerfold, and that nude centerfold then became the dominant image that was used to develop the JPEG. That image is now, some computer science journals have now banned the use of that image, but for years it was happening. And the deepfake technology, you may know, and others may know, was created by the man, he was called Deepfakes, to develop non-consensual pornography. It wasn't just pornography he wanted, because that's, the internet's awash with pornography. The technology was generated to develop non-consensual pornography. So I guess what I'm saying is there is a long history, both of tech advancing to use and abuse women, but also the drive for pornography generally, just advancing technology. And that's where we are now. We can see this with development of avatars. Avatars are now, you can make a photorealistic avatar of someone. So it's an avatar, but it looks like a particular individual. And you can then manipulate that avatar to do all sorts of things. So that I think is an emerging kind of harm we're going to have to be facing very soon, especially because many laws and regulations don't actually deal with that yet.
And generally speaking, I mean, national governments have been very reluctant to implement, robust regulation and take strong action against these tech companies. What more do you think they should be doing to mitigate the harms, both here and elsewhere, for example?
Yeah, it's almost baffling, isn't it, about how these tech companies are allowed to get away with what they do. I mean, you've got to hand it to them, haven't you? They've played a blinder. They are the massive industries dominating our lives with almost no regulation. You get in the car and it's safe, or it's safe because there's certain standards that have been imposed on the car manufacturers and they have to comply with it. You go and buy your coffee or your cake and a pastry, it's going to be safe. But yet with the technology companies, all this material is pumped out, especially to children, with almost no regulation. So it's, they've really managed to cajole us into thinking that regulation stifles innovation. And of course, another irony is that they create the technology, the algorithms that feed us certain content, So they can then just keep on feeding us the content, telling us how important they are and how regulation will hamper them, and we have no control over those algorithms. So, we're kind of almost stuck in this vicious cycle. But you asked what we could do. And I guess the point I'm trying to make with analogies with other industries is we could regulate them if we wanted to. They are not beyond regulation. It's just that there's a choice not to in many countries. But having said that, some countries are. I mean, the UK does have an Online Safety Act. The European Union has a Digital Services Act. And Australia has an e-safety commissioner, which is a pioneer around the world. So, and Korea, for example, is another good example of strong regulation. And although those forms of regulation aren't as good as one might want, they're still better. And for example, many of the the large internet platforms, they have different rules in place for these countries where there's stronger regulation. They know that they have to deal with that regulation. So that's the positive aspect. We could do more, and we're doing something, even if it's not as much as we might want.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the UK government's approach there, and they've, as I understand it, recently agreed to adopt a law criminalising the creation and solicitation of sexually explicit deepfakes. And I think you've called for image-based sexual abuse laws for many years, and your work's been very influential in persuading the government to change its approach. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about why this legislation matters, and how it came about. And is it strong enough? Are there loopholes even so?
Yeah, but you're right that so in England and Wales, we have just recently adopted the legislation. As you say, it will make it a criminal offence to create a sexually explicit deepfake. That will include using a Nudify app, for example. And you also rightly mentioned, and it's good to highlight, it's also going to make it an offence for you to request or solicit someone else to do this for you. Now, this is critical because this comes out of survivor experiences. The reality is that sexually explicit deepfakes are made often in these forums where groups of men are getting together, asking others to make the deepfake for them, sharing tips on how to do this, how to add in this video, etc. So in other words, it's a male group activity. And I've worked with a particular survivor who uses the name Jodie for her activism. And this is what happened to her. She found out that her perpetrator had gone onto one of these forums, asked others to make what's sometimes called deepfake porn of her, and it was then being distributed. But he was immune, effectively, from prosecution because he didn't make them, but he requested others to do so. So that's a really important part of the law, both because it comes from survivor experience, but it's that survivor experience that explains to us how abuse is perpetrated. And we had to fight hard to get that included. But, it was absolutely essential. And why is this law necessary? The law in England and Wales had just changed, and is the same in many countries. To share the material is unlawful. But we thought it was really critical to make creating it unlawful as well. So you would try to stop it at source, basically, particularly with these use of Nudify apps. And I mean, it's a criminal law. We're not talking about, enforcing this against thousands of others. One of the key points about it is to then relate to the regulation, because with deepfakes now, it's unlawful to make them, to distribute them, to ask someone else to do something about them. This then means that the regulation can be that much stronger because there is no good reason for these websites or Nudify apps. They're all unlawful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you think what you have is strong enough? Is the mechanism, are the mechanisms of enforcement going to work as you would hope?
I think the law is pretty comprehensive. We're pleased with that because the other main thing about this law particularly is that it's consent based. So the government first proposed that it would only be an offence to create sexually explicit deepfakes if you could prove certain motives on the behalf of the perpetrator. And we said no. We said this has got to be comprehensive and this has got to be based on consent. That's got to be the key point. This was a campaign with Baroness Charlotte Owen in the House of Lords, the organisations Not Your Porn, End Violence Against Women and Girls, and what have you. And this was our argument. And we won that argument as well. And why I raise that is that because I think the criminal laws are about expressing the values in society. And so for us, it was very important that this law was consent-based, because that's the message. Don't make sexually explicit images of someone else without their consent. Not just if you've got certain motives. Every time. It's never correct or a right thing to do. So I think the criminal law is expressive. It's got an expressive value. And so consent was therefore important. It will be important to prosecute it in some cases. But the criminal law is not just, I think, for me, about that prosecution. It is about trying to alter our attitudes and our behaviours. Because the reality is the police can't enforce every criminal law anyway, whether it's, theft, shoplifting, assault, you name it. It's all about all of us in society accepting that that's the law and the norms, and therefore just integrating that into our daily lives. And so that's the idea behind a criminal law such as this.
Yeah, that was something we wanted to ask you about, really, because obviously you're a legal scholar. A lot of your work is about trying to change legislation. So I guess clearly you believe that the law can be used to create positive change in society. Do you want to say any more about that, about how that kind of motivates your work? Like, have you seen the law help to achieve change, or what is it that kind of you've already said a bit about that, but what is it which leads you to want to kind of focus on the law as an area that can help to change things, I suppose?
So ending violence against women and girls obviously needs a kind of comprehensive, holistic approach. So it needs educators, it needs sociologists, it needs policymakers, it needs people from all disciplines, AI, etc. My expertise is in the legal regulations. So I think that plays a critical part, but I would never say that it is the most important or it's, fundamental or in that sense. It's part of a broader picture. But what the law can do is, like I say, in the criminal law, it can set the foundation in terms of the values in society, but it can also then provide options for redress for those who've been harmed. Obviously, you can, if you have a effective legal system in process, they can get some sort of, vindication, redress, justice, whatever they might want. Do I see the law changing to improve things? Yes. We can use the law to institute changes that we want to. It's. You could do that. You could see that through all walks of life in terms of things like discrimination or equal pay, pregnancy discrimination. I know these things are still there, but they're not as, common or prominent as in many other contexts. So we can use the law for positive good. The caveat is, of course, the law can be used negatively. And if you're talking in the criminal justice system, there is deep injustices in the criminal justice system, particularly for Black and minoritized women and for Black and minoritized men who are disproportionately criminalized. That is very true. And there are areas of the law in which it is interpreted and enforced in ways against the vulnerable or the more marginalized. So all of those things are true, but I don't think that means we should abandon the law. I think we should, work ever harder trying to convince people to use the law for positive uses and positive gains.
You have written about this, haven't you? About, I suppose, given the huge scale and devastating nature of violence against women in society, as we need any tool available to us to help create change. And you've written as well about how perhaps we need to have kind of complex approaches when it comes to addressing these issues, that maybe it's not helpful to have kind of either or binary solutions being proposed, that you're either completely in favor of so-called kind of carceral approaches or you're completely for abolition of all criminal justice institutions. Do you want to say a little bit about that, about how you've tried to adopt that kind of nuanced thinking in your own work when it comes to feminism and addressing violence against women?
Well, thank you for talking about it in that way and as nuanced. I think all of us as academics love to be described as taking a nuanced approach, don't we? So thank you for that. In this particular context, especially around criminalisation, that is what I've tried to do. And partly that's because it relates back to my work around online abuse and emerging technologies, because I'm working with survivors all the time who are experiencing these new forms of abuse. And the law basically often does not cater for them. The criminal law was not designed with women's harms in mind. We fall through the categories, basically, existing law. And lots of my work has been about trying to develop new categories like image-based sexual abuse, and also trying to, cover those gaps so that women are, and it's predominantly women who are victims of these forms of abuse. But what that means is many survivors I've worked with seek a criminal justice response. Some of them just do. They just do. That for them, for some of them, not all of them, for some of them, that is what they see and understand as justice. And one of my problems with some of the anti-carceral feminism, when it says no new criminal laws should be adopted, you're basically saying to those women victims of these new and emerging forms of abuse, you're not allowed criminal justice responses. Your vision of justice is not one that we're going to support or uphold. And I don't understand why those women don't deserve a criminal justice response if that's what they want, whereas a woman who is, say, physically assaulted, groped, to use that term, on a bus, I don't know, in a queue, or some other form of existing physical criminal offence, she is able to take a criminal justice response. But the woman experiencing the life-threatening, life-shattering abuse that comes from some online forms of abuse isn't. So that is why I advocate for some of these forms of criminal sanction, because it is what some women are seeking. But I don't see that as an either or for two main reasons. First of all, many of those women I work with have a very broad idea of what constitutes justice for them. It's not just criminal justice. I can think of Sally Rees, who is a teacher from Northern Ireland who was upskirted by a pupil of hers. And she had to fight to get the police to prosecute, but she then wanted to change the law for other women. But she then had to take legal action against her school, who'd completely dismissed her and basically told her to go back and teach the pupil. And that then set new guidelines for all other teachers. And she now is head of the union in Northern Ireland campaigning for better sex education. So her vision of justice is very broad, but it does include criminal justice. So that's why I think we can consider criminal justice, but it's not just solely criminal justice. It is about a much broader panoply of options for women and those who've been victimised. I've done research with the likes of Nicole Westmoreland and others about alternative ideas of justice, like about restorative justice. My vision would be for greater forms of restorative justice, for transformative justice mechanisms, for civil justice, for criminal justice, the wide range, really. And that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, I mean, you and Nicole have devised this concept of kaleidoscopic justice, haven't you, to try and kind of capture that diverse range of things that survivors want, including transformative justice, as you said, like kind of social change, I suppose, right? To make sure that what happened to them doesn't happen again. And I guess I was struck by that as well, that work you did around the role of prevention as well, that actually if victim survivors see society working to prevent this from happening again, that shows that they're recognizing what happened to them was wrong and was harmful, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Recognition, and that comes through prevention and education, has come out very strongly in the research Nicole Westmoreland and I did, but that others have done similar work, that is an idea of justice for some survivors, undoubtedly. And the irony, one of the ironies of the work that Nicole and I did, maybe 15 or so years ago around restorative justice, is that we at that time faced a lot of criticism for doing that work, because we were then told we weren't taking sexual violence seriously. But that work came from a survivor who wanted a restorative justice outcome. That was what her idea was, what she wanted. And, for her, it was transformative. She talked about, I just wanted him to hear me. I wanted him to understand. And she also talked about having the conversation with him was far more important for her than him ever going to prison. But we were criticised for that at the time, and we had to work really hard. Well, it was part of what we were doing to raise awareness of this being something that some victims wanted. And equally now, I find myself 15 years on advocating for criminal justice for some women, because that's what some women want as well. Yeah.
So it's shocking to consider how widespread different forms of image-based sexual abuse are. And this is, of course, something which is typically being perpetrated by men. So what do you think, Claire, is driving so many men to engage in such behaviours? I mean, that's a big question, I know, but do you have any insight on that?
It is a very big question, isn't it? But it's a very, significant and important one, to which, of course, I don't have all the answers. Many of these forms of abuse we're talking about are technology facilitated and online. And obviously, as we've all become more used to our smartphones and now with AI, it becomes that much easier to perpetrate many of these forms of technology. We see this most easily with something like deepfake technology. It used to be, and we're only talking 3-4 years ago, that you needed a bit of, computing knowledge, you needed time, you needed, the motivation and the effort to produce sexually explicit deepfakes. But now you can do it almost instantly, especially with nudification. So it's just that much easier to do. But that isn't the whole answer, is it? Because it'd be very easy for us to pick up a chocolate bar in a shop and walk out, but we don't, because we know it's theft, and we know that that's wrong. So there must be more to it as well. Unfortunately, I think one of the most difficult aspects of online abuse to understand is that groups of men are doing this as a kind of form of bonding and status building and gaining kudos amongst themselves, because there are many of these online forums where they're both exchanging things like nudes, but also exchanging tips of how to abuse others. And in my work, it's particularly at a policy level, that's been one of the most difficult aspects to talk to politicians about, because, and the public maybe generally, and the media, we like to think of people who perpetrate abuse as being the kind of oddballs or the others over there that we can easily identify and are a bit abnormal, and then we'll treat them. Whereas the reality is, because there is so much online abuse, it is average, everyday men and boys who are perpetrating it, and often in these groups. And that's definitely one of the biggest messages that's been a challenge. But that still leaves your question of why. Why are men doing that in these groups? Why is it that we're in a society where they're gaining kudos by abusing women and girls? And I'm afraid some of the answers to that in the online world are the intersections of capitalism, of the dominance of the tech industry, and patriarchy. Really, it still just underpins in a very silent but effective way an awful lot, I think, that is happening here.
And presumably what's happening online is also a reflection of the sort of misogyny and inequality that exists in the wider world as well.
It is. Although, of course, the online world turbocharges it. And I guess this is the point where we're saying, why are men and boys doing this? And of course, they are, like all of us, the victims, if we want to maybe call it that, of the dominance of the platforms. The algorithms that are feeding misogynistic content, particularly to teenage boys, for example, is the key problem. Many of these young male teenagers, they're not seeking out misogynistic content, and some of them are trying to avoid it, but it's very difficult to game that algorithm. And so they're being fed this material. So it's also not necessarily, everyone takes responsibility, but it's also not necessarily their fault when they're living in a culture that's grooming them almost into a misogynistic world. And that's the same if you're talking about the nudify apps. It's no wonder that a 13-year-old boy might use this when it's advertised on TikTok. He can access it through TikTok. And of course he then thinks that's normal or not so problematic. So there is that element. The online element, it does mean it's not just about a reflection of society, but it is those algorithms deliberately generating misogynistic content and feeding it to us.
I guess we have these ideas more broadly, don't we, that men, and especially young men, should be like hypersexual, should sleep with as many women if they're heterosexual as they possibly can, and should show off about that, should boast about that. And I guess, like online platforms, that's just turbocharged, isn't it, really? And I guess it's impossible as well, of course, to ignore the connections with pornography here. Which, of course, like many young men, boys will be coming into contact with from a very young age. And, how is that normalizing, I suppose, ideas about entitlement, for example, right? That sex is somehow for men and boys, for their pleasure, something which they're entitled to, and something which they, where they should be the ones in charge, dominating, and so on and so forth. But yeah, how would you say, Claire, that pornography has changed in recent times? How has it become more prevalent, I suppose? Has it become more extreme? Like, for example, you've written recently about how incest porn has become more and more prevalent, for example.
Yeah, so we do know that mainstream pornography, so, we're talking about those most popular porn sites such as, Pornhub, Xvideos, etc. We know it's become more extreme because we can compare content studies that were done 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago. And those content studies show us that the content has changed. And even in the most obvious ways, that content studies from 20 plus years ago didn't even identify, for example, in their long list of activities, if you like, that they were looking for, things like strangulation. Yet we know that choking, strangulation is dominant and common in pornography now. The incest material is very similar. Content studies from 20 years ago, there was hardly any of that material. We also know that, from some of the porn magazines of the time, we're talking about needing to find, new avenues or new interests and suggesting incest as one of them. And now that's a very common part of online mainstream pornography. So we know that it's more extreme in that sense, but we also, that's where this ties back into this discussion about the business model. The largest porn platforms have the same business model as Meta, Instagram, TikTok. They need to keep your attention on that site for as long as possible and you coming back as many times as possible so that they get the data and they can sell the ads. These are economic, money-making businesses. And they do that by pushing more extreme content, boundary-pushing content, the content that, unfortunately, all of us drives our kind of baser motives, the shocking material, all of those sorts of material is what then gets pushed. And it's algorithmic desire that's being pushed. Again, you've not got people necessarily going out and searching for this content. It's what gets pushed to them. And it then becomes cyclical. So it's what people then watch because they think, oh, why have 5 million people watched this? I'll watch this. And then you're also feeding the algorithm yourself by then watching it and liking it. And it becomes in an ever more kind of vicious cycle in a way. So it has got more extreme. You're right as well, though. When I talk about extreme material, you've made a very good point about the more kind of subtle messages around something like entitlement. And I think that's actually a really important point in the sense that, Pornhub, X videos, all of them, X hamster, the one thing they're not about is women's sexual pleasure. They are about, and I know women are visiting them for other reasons as well, but they're not about women's sexual pleasure. They are telling a story about the importance of male sexual pleasure, male sexual entitlement, about women who may resist at first, but in the end always want it, etc. That you can do almost anything and that they like it. So it's definitely also conveying those sorts of messages. And yeah, I mean, some of the material, I almost, so yeah, a lot of it is very grim. But some of the stuff that's actually not unlawful is also equally grim almost, because I think some of it displays a kind of loathing really for women and a deep disdain. I mean, it's about sexual arousal ostensibly, but really some of these men just seem to, they ooze this loathing for the women that are in those videos as well. And that's a message that gets through and is quite, it's very disheartening. Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering, I mean, how do you cope with that as a researcher? I mean, it's pretty tough stuff that you're viewing, obviously, and what does it do to you?
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, I've just finished, because I have just finished. I finished writing a book about the kind of harms of mainstream pornography, and some of it has been deeply despairing. And there's been times when I have wondered. I've often been thinking, why is this getting me more almost than many of my conversations, say, with survivors of abuse? And I think it's because I'm looking at material that is being viewed by millions of people, and is being viewed by millions of people who are thinking this is normal, acceptable, legitimate, and all the rest of it. It's that I think I have found really hard to deal with, compared to, say, speaking, like I say, to some survivors of online abuse, where I mean, we can, can still debate it, but it's still at least acknowledged that they've suffered, if you like. Whereas on some of the online porn material, there's not that same level of agreement or acceptance that actually it's problematic.
It's normalizing the equation of sex and sexual desire with like power and dominance, isn't it? It's like, actually, sex doesn't have to be about that at all, or about inequality, but it's completely normalizing that, isn't it? And it's interesting as well what you were saying, because I guess no doubt the porn companies would say, well, we're just giving people what they want. They're searching for it, and we provide what they want. But I guess your research shows that clearly what they're providing or what they're producing is changing over time, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the algorithmic model, this is not material that people are, it's not material that people are initially searching for. The 14-year-old boy, some might, but, is not generally not going on to look for forced stuff, to look for all sorts of other stuff. This is what gets fed to you algorithmically. And that's both in terms of the what's on, say, a front page or a landing page on a porn site the first time you visit it. And it's then the same with all the other suggestions that come up. You type in sometimes young, and then it'll offer you very young, or it'll offer you tiny. It then offers you all these other categories, if you like, that then become more extreme. I think it's really significant that we have to recognise the porn platforms as the business model that is shaping our behaviour in ways that they are dominating. We are part of it, like I say, by viewing certain stuff and by clicking certain stuff, but we're viewing and clicking the stuff that they're presenting to us. And then it becomes the feedback loop because the actors and the companies are then producing the material that is then being algorithmically highlighted. So you do then get into a very vicious cycle. And the one thing it's really not is a kind of, authentic idea or desire of what is, sexual pleasure. Is very much what is presented as keeping you engaged for longer, coming back for more.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say about that? Because I'm sure some people would say, well, like, it's not like somebody is just going to watch something online and then immediately going to go out and do that in real life necessarily. So, like, how would you explain the relationship between pornography and its potential influence on our sexual attitudes and behaviours?
So again, with the risk of repeating myself, it is just like social media to the extent that we know that social media influences and shapes our behaviour. That's how it makes millions of pounds. Meta would not have so much money unless it was shaping our behaviour to buy those things, to do those things, whatever, to stay online. And the porn platforms are just the same. 130 million people are viewing Pornhub every day. There are phenomenal statistics about the millions who are accessing these mainstream sites as we speak. How can it not be influencing our behaviours and attitudes? This is not about monkey see, monkey do. It's not about a man watching a forced sex video and thinking, oh, I know, now I'll go out and rape someone. That's not what we're talking about. But we are talking about this pornography influencing the police officer, the jury member, the person in the shop, your boss, into blurring the lines around what is consent and what's not consent. When you're seeing online on Pornhub all this forced porn, sleep porn, stealthing porn, etc., it's blurring the lines around what is lawful and unlawful, what's wrong and what's not, and what's consensual and what's not consensual, that then just filters into our culture. The PR and ad industries would not exist if they weren't able to shape our behaviour through media. And I think that's just the same through pornography. So generally, it's that sort of more process of shaping our attitudes and practices and beliefs that then infiltrates our actions. But there is also research. You can take sexual strangulation as a very clear example of where there's studies done of 4,000 people in Australia. You watch more porn, that means you see more images of strangulation porn, and they then go out and enact it more often. There is actually a direct causation there between watching more porn means you end up watching more strangulation, and you go out and you act out. Now, you can act out some strangulation consensually. I'm not saying that's all violence against women and girls, but it's actually deeply harmful, which is another aspect. And there's plenty of other studies as well where you ask men, where'd you get your idea? There's a BBC survey, where'd you get ideas around rough sex and strangulation? And over half of them say from porn, and 1 in 5 said they're really influenced by porn to then go out and act out what they're seeing, which in some ways I think is obvious, but that is, we know from asking men themselves that that's what they do as well. They watch porn and then they go and want to try some of it out.
I mean, you mentioned there the notion of the practice of sexual strangulation. I think it's right that the UK government has just announced that depictions of sexual strangulation in mainstream pornography are going to be made illegal, and that's partly as a result of your work again. But do you want to say anything more about the how this legislation has come about and your role in relation to that?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. You're absolutely right that we have now got a government announcement that it's going to restrict depictions of sexual strangulation, what's often called choking, in pornography. We're waiting the final details. This has come about. So my interest in this is the kind of wake-up call I had to the reality of the harms of sexual strangulation. And there is the harms, the immediate harms that can come from it, the dizziness, the bloodshot eyes, the coughing, the unconsciousness, and then it can lead to miscarriage and what have you. But over the last couple of years, the evidence that's come out, there's been a couple of studies that have done MRI studies of the brains of women, and they've been comparing, and it's young women because they're the ones who are mostly being choked or strangled. They compared the frequent strangulation, like 4 times a month, so like once a week, with the brain scans of those who hadn't been strangled. And what they're finding is that this is adversely impacting on women's brain functioning. It's impacting on their memory, it's impacting on their cognitive powers, etc. And then earlier this year, a study came out where, again, they took blood samples from young women who hadn't experienced strangulation compared to those who'd experienced frequent strangulation. And they found in those blood samples markers of brain damage. So for me, it really was this, oh my goodness, consent does not protect you here. This isn't a debate about consent. This is significantly harming young women, particularly, because they're the ones being strangled. Sexual minorities are more likely to be strangled, but also the sex workers who are in all these videos who are being frequently strangled. And it's just this very significant harm. Now, the link to pornography is that it's very common in pornography, and it's portrayed in pornography as if this is, well, normal, but also safe and, pleasurable, etc. Which is why I think those depictions need to be restricted. And interestingly, in the UK, offline, you've not been able to get this stuff for years offline. It's just that the online regulation has not kept up with it. So yeah, I make no apologies whatsoever, actually, for trying to limit what's portrayed in the pornography. But I actually also think we are in urgent need of a mass public education campaign around what's going on, because also there's been studies again in Australia looking at some of the kind of internet advice about strangulation, again talking about it as if it's normal and acceptable, and there are safe ways to do it, which there just aren't. So there's a lot of work we have to do right across the board here. And there is an Australian campaign called Breathless, which I think is a really good example that Mary Crabb and others are doing, and that we need to try and follow.
Yeah, God, it's so shocking hearing you talking about all these terrible forms of violence and abuse. And I mean, we have quite a lot of parents, I think, who listen to our show as well. And without wishing to scare them, too much. I mean, actually, they need to know about these things, don't they?
Yeah, well, absolutely, and need to try and be talking about it with their young people at as early an age as possible, both about pornography literacy and understanding more about pornography, but particularly about practices like strangulation. Yeah, that it's just not, it really isn't safe. And it's actually, so that I've talked there about the perspective from women particularly, but we've also got to talk to the men about this is not, this is not safe that you might do this, but you might seriously harm the person you're doing this to, and that could actually put you in serious hot water with the police. If you seriously harm someone, and through that act, it could have serious repercussions for you. So we also need to be. I mean, that's not necessarily the way to be doing it, but that is a significant impact as well.
It's really sad, isn't it? Because I mean, even for young men, and obviously, if they're doing this, they need to take responsibility for that behavior and stop it. But also, this is not how you kind of build loving, caring, happy, intimate relationships with other people, isn't it? So like, it's just taking all of us further away from that, isn't it? And I guess everybody's losing out in the end. I mean, obviously women and girls particularly, but actually it's not good for anyone, is it?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, the irony is the porn industry sells us this vision of these porn platforms as being this amazing smorgasbord of every sort of sexual, appetite or kink you could ever want. But it's actually ruining our sex lives.
Yeah.
There's a study of young men, and many of them were saying that their first sexual experience was disappointing because they were so used to what was in porn. And I was so struck. I thought, oh my goodness, what have we done?
Yeah.
So that young men are disappointed with their first ever sexual experience with another human person. And young women as well there's also another survey about 1 in 4 young women who are having consensual sex, but they're saying they're fearful during it. So they're not labeling this as an assault, but they're scared. And one of the reasons they're scared is because of sexual strangulation. But also, this is so disheartening. Sexuality and sex is supposed to be about pleasure and intimacy and what have you. But yet, women are doing it, and many of them are feeling scared whilst doing it. That's just, and that's what some of this mainstream porn is doing to us. Now, the caveat is, of course, there is pornography, and pornography can be, positive, liberating, whatever, all of those kinds of things. But it's a small subset of what is out there at the moment, let's face it, because we are so dominated by these large porn companies. So I'm not saying that, all porn is bad. What I'm saying is this kind of algorithmic feeding of this extreme sexually violent, misogynistic, and we've not even yet talked about the racism in mainstream pornography. That is what's harmful and problematic.
So what sustains you, Clare? And because I really admire your courage, in doing this incredibly difficult work. What keeps you going, and keep working with such passion and commitment in achieving change in these really difficult areas?
Anger is a really good driving force, isn't it? And a lot of anger and kind of deep injustice at what I see drives me on, together with the realization, particularly, I'd say more recently as I've got older, the capacity to try to make a change, and just then feeling that obligation and drive to do my part. I mean, I feel so. I'm in my mid-50s. I feel like my generation have let down, frankly, the younger people, teenagers, and those in their 20s, 30s, because we haven't done enough to stop this kind of rife online abuse that is there, and the violence against women and girls, and how porn has been able to develop into what it has. I really feel like we've let people down, and so it's incumbent upon people like me to try and do what we can to try and remedy that, really, in the ways that we can. But I'm sustained, like many of us are, by a community of support. The survivor activists I work with, who, my goodness, the determination they have to raise their heads above the parapet and seek change. The organisations like End Violence Against Women and Girls and Not Your Porn, who work on this, so they're the community as well that help keep me going, to try to do our bit. Yeah. But I mean, gosh, it's a difficult environment at the moment, isn't it? To do all of that. And it's certainly, been even more of a challenge over the last year or so.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for the work you do and like all of the change you've helped to achieve. Yeah, I'm very grateful there are people like you out there doing that work. So thank you.
Yeah.
We all play our part, that genuinely that's and so the work that you're doing in these podcasts, etc., giving me a forum to talk about this is all part of that movement for change, isn't it, that we've got to try and keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you're also very humble, so but yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, that was
thank you
great. I mean, there are lots of fascinating insights in your talk there, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking about that material because it's so difficult. So, Stephen, that testimony there from Clare McGlynn was so shocking, really, that I felt we needed to have a cup of tea and a biscuit before we could actually discuss any reflections on what she'd said. So we've now done that. And how are you thinking about our conversation?
Well, it's nice, isn't it? Because we always, once we finish the interview, we always take a little break for a cup of tea and a biscuit. But it's nice to actually be able to do that together for once.
Oh, that's true.
And then we have a little ramble about what the podcast was about. And then we realise we should have just recorded that. But yes, anyway, here we are.
You're revealing too much now, Stephen.
You don't want to go too far behind the curtain. But no, as I totally agree with you. I'm so awe-inspired by Claire's passion and kind of, courage to keep doing this work, even though it's so difficult and challenging and grim. And she has achieved a great deal of change and impact, hasn't she, in her work, which she's
absolutely.
and she's incredibly modest about that, but she has. I mean, one thing I wanted to go back right to the beginning, though, thinking about artificial intelligence and the tech industry. And I think it's just so important, isn't it, to just acknowledge the impact that this, multi-billion-dollar industry, which is obviously very varied. There's lots of different elements to it, but the impact it's having on our lives and how little regulated it is all in all, and how much influence it's having on our politics. Like if you look at what's been going on in the US, for example, obviously you've got Elon Musk massively funding Trump and the Republicans. Obviously, they've now had a bit of a falling out, but also people like Peter Thiel having a huge influence on the government over there. And like so often these organizations are, they are, as we said, they're very masculinized, aren't they? They're run by these tech bros.
Yeah, they're basically rich white men, aren't they?
Exactly. And it's just like this new version of patriarchy and capitalism, really, isn't it? And I don't think we're really getting to the roots of that. And so that does make me incredibly concerned about things like AI, I have to say, because I can see how that could be really positive and useful to society in theory, but actually, like in reality, in this kind of capitalist age we're living in, where it's all being run by these for-profit companies who are just being completely unregulated, basically. I just ask myself, like, do we really need any of this stuff that they're trying to foist upon us, in which they're extracting our data, right, in order to make lots of money to then sell things back to us? Even podcasts, apparently, like, one thing they use for their algorithms, in addition to like all the text on the internet, they extract all the material from podcasts, which are of course freely available, and they can use podcasts to train them about what the human voice sounds like, for example. I don't know how helpful our podcast is in that respect.
That might be difficult to digest, but anyway, we'll see.
But there was a great talk I went to recently by a Basque researcher called Aitor Jimenez, and he's written a book called The Crimes of Digital Capitalism, and he was talking about how like so much of our infrastructure, obviously now we're so reliant on tech for every aspect of our lives. And he was using the example of education. Now most schools will have computers, right? Like my niece, we were talking about it today, they all have Google laptops, for example, right? So this is like vital infrastructure, and it's all privatized. It's all being owned by private companies in a way that it wouldn't have been in the past. Just think what they have so much of our data. Same with the porn companies. That's how they make a lot of their money, is through the data that they have on us. I just think...
And also that, some of these tech companies make claims of self-regulation, which governments very easily buy. And clearly that just it's for the birds, really, that they're regulating themselves, given the material that's being produced.
Exactly.
So, that's absolute nonsense.
Exactly. And I do think with the porn is a very good example of how they're just, I do think often this tech is just sucking out so much of the life and care and connection which human relationships make possible. They're extracting all of that creativity out of so many different aspects of our lives. And that's, I am turning more and more into a Luddite because that's something that really concerns me, basically.
Yeah. And then, all these deep fakes and what are they, cyber brothels and, but they, the arguments made that, this is the virtual world. So as you were saying in the podcast, it's got nothing to do with reality. They don't do these things in the real world. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say there's a direct read across, but I think they're highly influential.
Absolutely.
And that's a, huge problem.
Totally. Yeah. What else did you think about this conversation?
Well, I mean, I was very interested in the section on sort of victim survivors and their view of what justice amounts to. I think that's a very interesting area, and I don't really have anything particularly profound or insightful to say about it, but I do think that's interesting as to how those people who have been victimized perceive the justice system and what should happen, and should it be carceral solutions or should it be restorative justice? If they're going to get their lives back, maybe they do need to have that possibility. So I was interested in that.
Oh, yeah, and so often they're not taken into account at all, really, are they? So,
No. The other thing which didn't really occur in our conversation, but I think is very relevant, is the whole notion of language and what language denotes. And so, for example, I know that Claire doesn't use or like the term revenge porn, which is quite widely used. I mean, that puts the emphasis on the victim. For a start, and it also, often the kinds of terminologies used cover up the nature of what's going on, so that it's not actually seen as abuse, which is what's going on, image-based abuse. So I think I'm quite intrigued by how precise language actually can be used to identify what is going on, and we should all think about that in the way we talk about these issues.
Definitely, and it shows, doesn't it? The popular terms, also dick pics is another one. It just shows how we as a society are treating these things, isn't it? Which, as you say, is just really trivializing it, or almost just saying to women and girls, this is something you just have to expect as part of your day-to-day life, basically. But yeah, is that enough from us?
I think that's probably enough from us.
Perhaps we can go and have another biscuit. But
well, we can't, Stephen, because we've eaten them all.
But well, we wish you all the best with your own tea and biscuits, and thank you as always for listening. Do subscribe to Now Men if you haven't already. Contact us at nowamen@gmail.com if you have questions or comments, and we'll be back with another episode soon.
Yeah, good to talk to you.
You too, Sandy. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.